In this shooting series episode, we're going to be looking at drone photography. Now, drones are fantastic tools, but we often focus on the amazing footage they can produce. But they're becoming increasingly capable of stills photography too. So before we take the drone out, I'll just quickly run you through the typical setup that I use for stills photography with a drone. For all the footage and images you're about to see, I used a DJI Mavic 2 Pro. Now, the reasoning behind this is that it gives you a great balance between the photography and video capabilities. Some drones will have more of a video-centric focus, which often means fewer megapixels to deliver better results and avoid pixel binning or sensor cropping. This drone, however, has a 20 megapixel 1-inch sensor, which just gives it that extra edge for stills photography whilst allowing it to remain reasonably compact. So once we've got the phone connected to the controller and the controller connected to the drone, the settings on the app pretty much default to automatic. Now, by default, it starts out on video mode, so I'll just tap here to toggle it across to the photo mode. If we open up the settings menu, we'll see everything is pretty much on full automatic. For stills photography, I tend to favour switching to aperture priority mode. This enables me to change the aperture down here, and the camera will calculate the appropriate shutter speed. I'll also disable auto ISO here, and where possible keep this at the lowest value, which is 100, to ensure the cleanest images. If I need to adjust the exposure, I'll tend to use the exposure compensation option down here. Now let's switch across to the camera tab. The top option lets us choose from several different shooting modes. For the majority of images, you'll probably be using single shot mode, but for example, to manually merge together HDR imagery, the auto exposure bracketing shooting mode is a good option. The most crucial option though is perhaps the image format here. Now, by default, this is set to JPEG, and we definitely want to change this to either RAW or JPEG and RAW. If you intend on doing more than just basic editing to your shots, you'll want the raw information on hand to work with. White balance I tend to set whilst I'm out, depending on the conditions. In most cases for daytime shots, I leave it on sunny, and for low light or nighttime shots, I'll switch across to incandescent. Now we have the style option, which dictates the processing applied to in-camera JPEGs. I'll switch this across to custom, and we have three options here: sharpness, contrast, and saturation. I've found a combination that works for me, which is sharpness set to 1, contrast set to -3, and saturation to +3. The saturation control isn't actually that dramatic, so it lends a nice little colour boost to your JPEG images. We're not done yet. Across on the next tab, we have several options that are worth exploring for stills photography. If you're shooting panoramas and hyperlapses, you'll want to enable the Save Original options here, which will ensure the camera saves the original unstitched files. You can also toggle the option to RAW here to ensure it writes the RAW files too, which is useful if you want to maximise the quality of your stitching in post-production. I'll also turn on the histogram here to give me an idea of the scene's exposure. Now, if a scene is quite low in contrast and the dynamic range is not particularly challenging, I'll often intentionally overexpose the image in order to increase the signal-to-noise ratio and end up with a cleaner image. I also turn off the Enable AFC mode. This switches the autofocus from continuous to single mode, which is much more applicable for stills photography. It also means you can operate autofocus a bit like back button focusing on conventional cameras, meaning you can autofocus once, lock the focus off, and then recompose and take multiple shots. Further down, I'll sometimes enable the grid to aid with getting my compositions right. Then the last option that I'll change is peaking threshold, and this controls your focus peaking. I set this to high, which increases the threshold at which to display sharp detail. Although it's sometimes harder to see, it gives me a more accurate idea of whether my shot is in focus. If the threshold is set to normal or low, you may sometimes be tricked into thinking your shot is in perfect focus, when in fact it's just slightly unsharp. Now, I don't tend to change any of the controller settings, apart from enabling multiple flight modes, seen here. And this just allows you to switch between different modes on your drone. It's invaluable for getting blur-free shots in low light since you can use tripod mode. Right, that's enough tweaking. Let's get this drone out and start taking some photos with it. Okay, so we go through the startup procedure, connect the phone and controller to the drone, then begin takeoff. We can begin flying around finding compositions. And what I'm doing here is tapping on screen to focus the shot, then tapping the shutter button. When I have clear line of sight and there are no obstacles, such as power lines, I'll often switch over to sports mode so the drone moves faster, allowing me to quickly reposition it and find a new composition. Once I've found the composition, I'll then switch to positioning or even tripod mode to provide more stability and ensure the shot is sharp. Although in good light, with fast shutter speeds, you could comfortably leave it on sports mode. Here I'm just flying around, finding some different angles for this composition. Personally, I love huge wide vistas that really show off the environment, so I'm always trying to get as wide as possible. But there are all kinds of different shot compositions we can explore with drone photography. Here's a shot I've picked out from the ones I took with some editing. Something we may overlook is that we can get really interesting top-down shots using a drone. A great example is if you take the drone somewhere predominantly flat, like Norfolk in the UK. Flying the drone overhead and then looking down 90 degrees allows us to discover these fascinating patterns in the marshland. These kind of shots are probably the best example of something you can only achieve with a drone. Here I'm focusing, then repositioning to get some really interesting textural shots. Here's an example of what I captured after some editing. During this session, I also captured some other shots, including these sandy dunes, which take on a completely different look from above. We've also got this really textural area right by the sea, and this little scene that tells a story with the boat stuck on dry land. Again, I'm taking a similar approach here. I'm flying the drone right up to the maximum height limit to try and capture a unique view of the sea meeting the sand. Although it doesn't sound like much time on paper, most consumer and prosumer drones offer you about 20 to 25 minutes of flight time per battery. And that's often more than enough time to experiment with different angles and compositions for several scenes at a time. You need not feel too rushed, so take your time to make sure you're happy with the shots you're taking. Panoramas are great fun to shoot with drones. Although most drones come with built-in panoramic modes via their apps, I prefer to shoot them manually for greater control. What I like to do is shoot 2 or more rows for greater vertical resolution. In this example, I'm positioning the first shot to the left of the rainbow. Then I'm gradually nudging the drone to the right whilst taking photos, ensuring some overlap between the shots. I then position the view upwards and begin taking the second row of shots, moving back across to the left of the rainbow. Now I can't quite remember my starting point, so I choose to take a final shot that may or may not be redundant. Here's the final stitched panorama with plenty of vertical resolution, which has enabled me to capture a very faint double rainbow. When it comes to shooting HDR imagery, you can take a similar approach. One method is to switch the shooting mode to auto exposure bracketing, and here you can choose between 3 or 5 shots with what appears to be 1 EV spacing. Because the shots are so close together, this will give you a set of images that are easy to HDR merge in post-production. You may find the dynamic range of the scene requires a greater difference in exposure values though, which means we'll need to tackle it manually. For this shot, I'll switch from aperture priority mode to manual. I need to pick a smaller f-stop value to ensure I can reach the required exposure values with the available shutter speeds. Here I've started at 1/40, and I can then increase the shutter speed to 1/160 and take a second shot. I can even go to 1/400, which in this case was actually unnecessary, before slowing the shutter speed down to 1/25. Now, to avoid going any slower with the shutter speed, I'll actually open the aperture up to f4.5. Normally this isn't advisable, but any difference in sharpness or depth of field is going to be negligible with this composition. A bit of HDR merging and editing later, and we end up with this, where we've captured the dramatic sunset whilst retaining nice detail in the foreground. Here's another example where I've eased off on the local contrast for a more natural looking sunset. Sometimes if you're unsure about using autofocus, You can also switch over to manual focus. Tapping the infinity icon sets the focus to infinity, and for general wide shots, this ensures the shot will be sharp. I've found it's a useful fallback if you're shooting in low contrast scenes where the autofocus might struggle, and in combination with a high peaking threshold, it's just some extra reassurance that your shot will be in focus. Perhaps the most exciting prospect for me with drone photography is low-light urban photography. For this, we need to adjust our settings. First, we definitely need to switch to tripod mode. This will attempt to keep the drone as still as possible. Next, we need to set the white balance. Now, you can leave this on auto and you'll likely get a good result, but just to ensure consistency between shots, I'll change it to incandescent. Next, we need to look at our aperture and ISO. We can stay in aperture priority mode, but we'll want to open up the aperture to its maximum value, in this case f2.8. The ISO also needs to increase. I've initially set it to 1600, but we'll see if we can get away with 800 whilst maintaining a usable shutter speed. ISO 800 and f2.8 is giving me a shutter speed of 1/2, which I've found is just about on the cusp of achieving a sharp image with this drone. Really, it depends on the wind conditions. Now, initially, I am using autofocus to focus on the scene, but just to play it safe, I'll switch to manual focus and set it to infinity. The peaking threshold here tells me the shot is in focus, so I can go ahead and capture the image. There we go, a bit of editing and I'm happy with that shot. Here's another shot I took from this session, which I love because of the winding light trails and the contrast between the orange and white lighting. I appreciate it's hard to know from the app whether the shots you've taken are sharp or blurry. For example, I've dropped the exposure compensation to -1 stop here, giving me a shutter speed of 1/4, and I'm not sure whether that's fast enough to avoid blurring the shot. You can enter the playback mode of the app, which gives you a grainy, low-resolution version of the shot, and you can kind of get a rough idea as to whether it's sharp enough. But here is a better solution. Tap the download icon and it will copy across the JPEG version of the image. You can then find that downloaded JPEG in your photo library, and it's the full resolution version, so you can zoom in and scrutinize it in more detail. Here we can see that although it's a bit noisy, the detail is indeed sharp, so we've got both correct focus and a fast enough shutter speed. That was a 1/4 shutter speed, but depending on wind conditions, I found you can go as low as 1 second, which you can use both to blur motion in the scene, such as moving cars, and to achieve an exposure using lower ISO values, which of course results in cleaner imagery. So there we go. I hope that's given you some inspiration to try out stills photography with drones. They're fantastic tools, and once you get past that initial trepidation of piloting one, they're also great fun. Just make sure you follow any drone laws and codes of conduct applicable to your country and fly it responsibly. Keep other people's safety in the back of your mind at all times, and always look up areas you want to fly at in advance. There are plenty of resources to determine where no-fly zones and restricted areas are. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to check out the other shooting series videos and the articles that accompany them.